Hello, everyone. I hope you are having a fantastic Saturday, and I am so excited to welcome you to our program today, Women's Suffrage in Black and White. My name is Alyssa Hunt. I am the program director here at the Alice Paul Institute, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to Susan Philpott, who is a National Park Service Ranger. She has been for over 10 years, and she serves at Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument in Washington, D.C. Susan has a bachelor's and master's degree in public history from University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and loves talking about people who have impacted social change and worked to make our country more inclusive and diverse, and who have had an impact on the way our society understands itself. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to Susan and let her tell you a little bit more about herself and about the program she's going to be doing today.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here real quick and get started. Let's see, can I get the slideshow going? There we go. Okay, and so as I introduce myself, I'm going to ask you, if you feel comfortable with this, with sharing this, to share one thing about yourself in the chat. Only one. So just pick one thing about yourself that you want to include and put that in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and our program today. As Alyssa mentioned, I'm Susan Philpott. I'm a park ranger at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument in Washington, D.C. And let's see, one thing about myself, I have a dog named Chester. And I mentioned that especially because although my background looks like I'm coming from Belmont Paul, I'm actually at home, and every once in a while, Chester has to speak up. So if you hear a little barking, I'm sorry about that. That's just Chester saying hello. Today, we're going to be talking about women's suffrage in black and white. And so the story of race in the fight for women's right to vote. And we call this a facilitated dialogue. When I do this in person, we really do it as a way to encourage conversation, which is a little harder when we're doing it virtually. I'm going to have some questions along the way that you are that I'd invite you to respond in the chat about, and then when we get to the end, I hope to open it up for questions and discussion and anything further that you want to talk about. Now, of course, the idea of women and race is a huge topic that we can't cover everything in this amount of time that we're going to be talking about. But we're just going to scratch the surface and look particularly at the things that people said in the time, looking at their own words. So just like you can't encompass your whole self in the one thing you're putting in the chat, we can't cover everything in the story. If there's something that I didn't talk about that you want to talk about, I definitely would invite you to talk about that when we get to the end here. So just a little background, this is where I work. This is the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. It's in Washington, D.C., right on Capitol Hill at the corner of Constitution Avenue and 2nd Street Northeast. We're across Constitution Avenue from the Supreme Court. That white building you see there in the back is the Hart Senate office building, which lately has been a place where lots of demonstrations have been going on. So that means lots of senators have their offices looking out right over our spot. And Alice Paul was very deliberate in picking a spot right there in the heart of everything. In fact, one of the National Women's Party members indicated that they wanted an embassy for the women of the nation and a vantage point where they could keep Congress under perpetual observation. So very deliberate about choosing this stately old house right in the center of everything. And this is the interior of the museum, which I would love to invite you to someday. We are still not open because of COVID, and we are due to have some renovations soon, so I don't know if we're going to get to open before that starts. But this is the entranceway, and you can get a sense as you look around. It looks very similar to the way it did when Alice Paul was living and working there. This idea of coming into the entrance and being surrounded by women, the women of the National Women's Party, the women who had come before, and you'd probably notice as you came in and looked around, if you stood there for too long, you'd probably notice it's a lot of well-to-do white women in these pictures. And that is not a full picture of what the fight for women's suffrage or women's equality in general has been throughout history. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more. And one thing that really sort of kicked off this idea of having this conversation was an editorial that Brent Staples wrote in the New York Times in July 2018. And so that's just as everyone's sort of gearing up to this idea of marking the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, of women winning the vote. And this editorial was called "How the Suffrage Movement Betrayed Black Women." That's a pretty stark headline, and it came with this picture of Susan B. Anthony. I don't know why someone took a portrait of her back, but this idea of Susan B. Anthony sort of turning her back on a whole section of women fighting for equality. So that kind of got people talking, and we're going to take some of the things that Brent Staples was looking at and expand on them. One of the things he made, one of the points he made, which is an important point, is that for a long time, the history of women's suffrage that we had was the history that was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and then later Ida Husted Harper. So they're telling the story about themselves, which, you know, we're so grateful that they did, because of course, back at the time, women's history wasn't making it into any books, and so they took it upon themselves to make sure this history was recorded. But of course, just like what you wrote about yourself in the chat probably is not something that you're embarrassed about or ashamed of, or maybe a fight that you're having. These women kind of put themselves at the center of the story, where certainly they deserve a prominent space, and left out the stories of people that that were more problematic. So we're going to go from what they looked at and see what are they talking about and what are they not talking about, and what happens as we move beyond into the 20th century. So a lot of people kind of mark the beginning of the fight for, or an important moment at least, in the fight for women's rights and women's right to vote in that Seneca Falls Convention in July 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and other women. 2 days to talk specifically about the history of, about the issue of women's rights, and drawing up their own mission statement. The Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence. But it says that all men and women are created equal. And like the Declaration of Independence, most of this document is a list of all the ways that women are not treated equally. And it starts with this premise that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having a direct object, the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. And then the list of all the tyrannies that women endured. And you know, we at the Belmont Paul, since we're specifically really focusing on the issue of the 19th Amendment, we're very interested in the first one. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. But of course, the right to vote is just one of many things on this list. And here is one of the others that's on there. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded of men, both natives and foreigners. Now, this is a group of abolitionists, really, who are also there to talk about women's rights. These are pretty radical positions that these women are in, that these women and men are part of. They're really looking at upending everything about the way society functions. But even they are still thinking in terms of hierarchy, that there's a hierarchy of people, and they're just arguing that basically women are in the wrong place. But they still have this idea that there are categories of people who are, as they put it, ignorant and degraded, both natives and foreigners. So it's good for us to come from a place that these people are talking about really important things. They're not always, though, talking about equality. And this idea of what equality looks like and what fairness and justice and liberty look like are something that they're wrestling with the whole time through all the periods that we're talking about. Now that convention, which was really kind of a local convention, kicked off this idea of women's rights conventions, and they blossomed. There's another one a couple months later in Rochester, and more women's rights conventions are being held. Now, at that first women's rights convention in 1848, as far as we know, Frederick Douglass was the only African American to attend, as far as we can tell. And he is one of the few that's standing up and supporting Elizabeth Cady Stanton in this idea that one of the things women have to fight for is the right to vote. But as more of these conventions are held nationally and even internationally, more and more people are coming and getting their voices heard. And one of the people who attends these meetings is Sojourner Truth, who is coming from a perspective that she had been enslaved and demanded her own freedom, changed her name because she believed it was her job to sojourn, to go around the country and tell people the truth. And so she's telling people the truth at a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851, so a couple of years later. And she stands up in front of that convention and she says, you know, can I be heard? And what she says is, I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man, and I can eat as much too as if I can get it. I am as strong as any man is now. So this idea that, you know, if you want to talk about equality, white women and men, you know who you need to be talking to is Black women, because nobody treats us as if we're somehow delicate and fair, that we have to be protected and privileged. We're expected to endure the same sort of abuse as men, do the same amount of work as men. We embody the equality that you're talking about. Now, that quote I just read comes from the version of the speech that was written down by Sojourner Truth's friend Marius Robinson in the Anti-Slavery Bugle, just very soon after she gave the speech. You may have heard this referred to as the "Ain't I a Woman" speech. In the version Marius Robinson writes down, Sojourner Truth never says, "Ain't I a woman?" That version of the speech was written down in 1863 by Frances Gage, another abolitionist and suffragist. And in that version, Frances Gage is giving Sojourner Truth a Southern accent she didn't have, because she was born in New York. Her first language was Dutch, and almost kind of weakening the power of her speech. As poetic as it is, Sojourner Truth in that version of the speech comes off as kind of uneducated and folksy. It's lessening the power of what she had to say. And it gives us a sense of how, just in that amount of time, that things are being sort of rewritten about what Black women are saying. So, as I mentioned, many of these suffragists, women's rights advocates are also abolitionists. And as the Civil War comes along, these women's rights conventions are put on hold as women are supporting the Union cause and the abolition of slavery, which finally comes in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. Slavery is abolished. And at the next meeting of Women's Rights Convention in May 1866, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper stands up to give a speech. Now, she was born free in Maryland and is an abolitionist and a fighter for civil rights. And at this speech that she gives, she's already sort of sensing that there's a little bit of tension now, that these issues that have been joined are now kind of at odds. And in that speech, she says, born of a race whose inheritance has been outrage and wrong, most of my life has been spent in battling against those wrongs. But I did not feel as keenly as others that I had these rights in common with other women, which are now being demanded. So in other words, she saw herself first as having to deal with issues of race, and now she's seeing also that she has to deal with issues of sex, of being a woman. And she recounts the hardships that she goes through after her husband dies that she wouldn't have had to deal with if she had been a man. And in that speech, she says, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, that we shouldn't be at each other, we should be joining each other. It's very similar to something Martin Luther King would say, 100 years later, that we are tied in an inescapable garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are all bound up together. Frances Harper doesn't make it into the history of women's suffrage that Stanton and Anthony and Gage write. Sojourner Truth is in there. Frances Harper isn't. Now, after the Civil War, there's a big thing that happens, of course, after slavery is abolished, is then, well, what is the status of these newly freed people? There's been a Supreme Court decision that says that the Black man doesn't have any rights that the white man is bound to recognize. So are they citizens? Do they have the same rights as white citizens? And so perhaps my history professor would always argue that everything goes back to this amendment, the 14th Amendment, perhaps one of the most important amendments to the Constitution, that says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens, and that they have the right to due process and equal protection under the law. And that is the part that everybody knows. There's another section to the 14th Amendment, and it has to do with voting. It's a little weird the way it's worded, but what it says basically is about the right to vote, and states protecting the right to vote for male inhabitants. That's the first time that the word male shows up in the US Constitution. And this sets many of the women suffragists at a real concern. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton says, if that word male makes it into the Constitution, it will take us 100 years to get us out. And so here's something that's very important in this new reconstructed nation, that Black people are citizens. But what about that word male? Do we support the 14th Amendment? In the midst of this, the group that had been the abolitionists or the anti-slavery form an organization called the American Equal Rights Association, this idea of equal rights for everyone. And one of the things that's at debate now is, well, what about the 14th Amendment? What about that word male? Are we only looking at Black men's rights? And Sojourner Truth at one of those meetings in 1867 calls this out. Again, she's talking about what she embodies as a Black woman. I feel that if I have to answer for the deeds done in my body just as much as a man, I have the right to have just as much as a man. There's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. And if colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the woman, and it will be just as bad as it was before. So she is standing up and saying, wait a minute, there's something that we as Black women need to be listened to, and we are under threat if we're forgetting about women's rights and just focusing on race and not sex. That year, 1867, was a year when it looked like Kansas was going to be the first state with universal suffrage, voting rights for everyone. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are there campaigning in Kansas to make sure that women get the right to vote. And the resolution fails, and neither get the vote. And it's in that failure that there's sort of that rift is getting deeper as each side sees the other one's demands for rights getting in the way of theirs. And while Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are in Kansas, they meet a guy named George Francis Train, who I saw one historian described him as a combination of Liberace and Billy Graham. So this kind of dynamic guy who's supporting their cause for women's rights and women's right to vote. But one of the reasons he's doing it is because he's a racist and he doesn't want to see Black men get the vote. And he says a lot of racist things, and Stanton and Anthony don't say anything else, don't say anything about it. And so people are watching them throwing their hat in with this racist guy, and he starts funding their newspaper, The Revolution. And they are publishing things in their newspaper, The Revolution, under the masthead. Men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less. In the Revolution, which starts in 1868, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, under her pen name Sunflower, writes an editorial. And she says these words a few times. It's not just she writes them down, she says them out loud. She says, think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Young Tongue. So you have Irish and Black and German and Chinese who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who never read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for Lydia Marie Childs, Lucretia Mott, or Fanny Kemble. Those three names are all women who were abolitionists, who were well-known, educated, refined women. Lydia Marie Childs was a novelist. Fanny Kemble was an actor. So you can see these things creeping in there that there's a hierarchy and white women are in the wrong place. And Black men having the vote before white women is upsetting that hierarchy. We find white women, upper class white women ought to have this right before Black men. Of course, leaving Black women out of that story altogether. And it's in this kind of setting that the American Equal Rights Association has another meeting in 1869. And Frederick Douglass has something to say about these things that Stanton and Anthony are saying. You know, and he's basically saying, if there's gonna be a choice, if there has to be a choice, if we can't get both, then we have to have Black men with the vote first. And he says, when women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. This is a matter of life and death for us, Frederick Douglass says. He had stood up and spoke on the rightness, and would continue throughout his life, speak on the rightness of women having the vote. But he says at this time in 1869, we've got the 14th Amendment, but it's not working. There's another amendment that's been proposed, the 15th Amendment, that would guarantee that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but not sex. Frederick Douglass says, look, our lives are in danger. If we have to choose, it has to be us. And Susan B. Anthony asked him, well, don't Black women face this same danger? And his response is yes, but it's because they're Black, not because they are women. Now, here's the thing, something I'm sure all the women in that room were thinking as well. Women do face violence and danger because they are women. Black women and white women, all women have faced that throughout time. It's something that we find women there maybe couldn't talk about, but they knew that they faced danger too. But it is in the midst of this meeting that the American Equal Rights Association falls apart. So just something to reflect on for a moment about a time when you have felt pushed aside or ignored, when your needs, when your liberty, when your rights were being sidelined, how that felt. And that's the way these reformers, these revolutionaries are feeling in the midst of this, making this new nation. What will it look like? So the AERA falls apart, and in its aftermath, there are two women's suffrage associations that are formed. The National Women's Suffrage Association with Stanton and Anthony, who are just focusing now on the cause of women's suffrage, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone. Frederick Douglass joins that, Frances Harper joins that, that is interested in universal suffrage. Suffrage rights for women, but not at the expense of anyone else. And Frances Harper writes a novel around this time that called Many Sacrifice, where her characters are wrestling with these issues of race and sex and what this means. And this is something that, so you really get a sense of where she's coming from in the words of her characters. And one of the, a quote from that book, one of the characters, Minnie, is saying, "I cannot recognize the claim that the Negro man is the only one who has pressing claims at this hour. Today, our government needs women's conscience as well as men's judgment. And while I would not throw a straw in the way of the colored man, even though I know he would vote against me as soon as he gets the vote, yet I do think that woman should have some power to defend herself from oppression and equal laws as if she were a man." And you can just see Black women sort of being asked to choose between their race and their sex. And this idea of what we call intersectionality now is something that Black women especially are wrestling with at this time. Frances Harper also talks about how, as they're wrestling in this thing, she says, in the end, I have to choose race and let the lesser issue of sex go. But she says the white women all go for sex, which she's talking about their identity as women, but both sides are also kind of using sexual innuendo in their fight and their insulting of each other. One of the things that white women are saying to Black women that's part of this is, you know, if you have to throw your lot in with someone, you should support other women. And if white women are the only one who have the vote, we'll look out for you. Which of course is the same thing that black men are saying to black women. We're the ones who will look out for you. And black women are caught in the middle of that. When the issue of the 15th Amendment comes up, this is something that's quoted. It's put in as if Susan B. Anthony said it herself. I could not find evidence that she said it herself, but that Ida Husted Harper said it about her. That she would sooner cut off her right arm before she would ever work for or demand the ballot for the black man and not the woman. And so that idea of amputating something from yourself, and that's something that I think often as women are expected to be willing to sacrifice themselves for others, and to say that, no, Susan B. Anthony says she is choosing her identity as a woman, rather than, if she has to choose, she chooses herself. She chooses women. So you can just sense what a tense and trying time this is in this whole fight. And that's one of the things that Brent Staples quotes when he says that people like Susan B. Anthony are turning their back on black women. So the 15th Amendment does become part of the US Constitution in 1870. This is a portion of a famous engraving in Harper's Weekly showing the black men going to the polls, black men of all different walks of life, farmers and merchants and soldiers all going to the polls. But this is another engraving. It's called Electioneering in the South from the same time. And I just want to point out, you see the man talking and all the men gathered around, but you also see that the black women are listening too. They're on the side. They might be pushed to the sides in the back, but they're paying attention. They're leaning in. They're listening. And this is one thing that in this period of Reconstruction in the South, in that period of time when black men are voting before the violence and oppression against them disfranchises them again, that women see this act of voting as something that the community does, that they are participating in. It might be the men going to the polls, but black women see themselves as part of this process as well, and that this is the space where they're getting their voices heard. After the 14th and 15th Amendment passed, one of the things that the suffrage movement starts is what becomes known as the New Departure. And this is Victoria Woodhull here addressing the House Judiciary Committee, saying that the 14th and the 15th Amendment, because they're dealing with citizenship and women are citizens, they enfranchise women themselves. It's in there already. Our right to vote is there now. And you notice in this engraving, it's all white women. I just want to put a pin in that for a second. And that leads to things like Susan B. Anthony with a group of about 49 other women going to the polls in 1872 and casting their ballots and then getting arrested for voting. And that's usually the story that's told about Susan B. Anthony. But you know what? Susan B. Anthony wasn't the only one who went to the polls in 1872. Sojourner Truth went to vote too in Battle Creek, Michigan, where she was living. She didn't get arrested. She also didn't manage to vote, but she went all by herself. She didn't go. Well, she went with her grandson or nephew, I think, but not with a whole clan of women with her. She had the courage to go by herself. Oh, and this woman over on the right, Mary Ann Chad Carey, she led a group of about 90 women in D.C. in the District of Columbia to vote in 1871, so the year before. And they didn't get registered, but they made the registrar mark down that they had tried and write all their names down and get that recorded. Mary Ann Chad Carey also testified before the House Judiciary Committee. that's another thing that didn't get recorded, that her testimony didn't get recorded like Victoria Woodhull's did, testifying to the same thing. She was a woman who was ran her own newspaper, was a journalist and a teacher and an activist. In 1876, when Susan B. Anthony and another group of suffragists stormed the centennial celebration at Independence Hall in Philadelphia to demand women's right to vote, Mary Ann Shadd Cary sent them a letter with 94 black women's names saying, include us in this declaration, which that made it into the history of women's suffrage. The fact that they wrote it, but not their names got left out. But so we're going to return Mary Ann Shadd Cary to the importance what she deserves as an activist. In 1890, that split in the suffrage movement gets mended, and the national and American suffrage movements join with a rather awkward name, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. We call it NASA for short. And one of the things they begin in the 1890s is trying to move this movement out of the Northeast, where it's been mostly concentrated. There are places in the West where it looks where women are starting to gain a foothold, and they've really got their eye on the South. So in 1895, the first convention, women's rights convention in the South, is held in Atlanta, and the white leaders acquiesce to the segregationist ideals in the South, and they ask Frederick Douglass not to come, and they bar black women from attending. And then in 1903, they have another NASA convention in the South, this one in New Orleans. And they also bar black women from attending. This woman on the left here, Kate Gordon, has organized for women's suffrage, but she is adamant that it should only be white women, and they actually write legislation they try to get passed that says that the vote is only for white women, despite what the 15th Amendment says. Susan B. Anthony, after this convention, goes to visit the Phyllis Wheatley Club. These are women suffragists, black women suffragists who've been excluded from the NASA convention. And Sylvanie Williams, who's the woman in the middle here in this picture, addresses Susan B. Anthony directly as she's introducing her to speak, and says, compares the experience of black women to those of beautiful flowers who are being trampled underfoot. And then she says, yet she is advancing, she being the black woman, she is advancing, and sometimes you find her farther on than you might have expected. So this idea of, you keep pushing us aside and trampling us underfoot, but we are advancing and we are doing things that you are not realizing. The Phyllis Wheatley Club is affiliated with a new black women's organization that's been formed in 1896, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which is, the first president is this woman here, Mary Church Terrell, who is an internationally known suffragist, and she joins the National Women's Suffrage Association, actually, and is also a member of NASA. And she has traveled around the world. She speaks several languages and given speeches in the fight for women's rights. And at the NASA Convention in 1904, which is held in Washington, D.C., she basically calls out this foolishness about the way that the white NASA leadership is acting. She says, basically, you'll never get suffrage until the sense of justice has been so developed in men that they will give fair play to the colored race. You think you can get equality and push us to the side? No, the white men in power aren't going to give it to you while ignoring us. That what we need is a sense of justice for all people. this is at the same time that NASA leadership, like Anna Howard Shaw, are willing to say, basically, that, you know, segregationists in the South, you really should support women's suffrage, because that will help you maintain white supremacy. They say that specifically. They feel like they have to speak out when, not when they're accused of being racist, when they're accused of being integrationist, that they want to bring Black women and white women together. That's the thing they feel like they have to disavow and say, you know, what? Oh, we don't take a position on segregation or integration. We leave it up to all the chapters themselves. But really, the way I understand it, the more white women voting will mean that you'll be able to maintain white supremacy. And Kate Gordon, who was the leader of the Louisiana chapter of NASA, eventually leaves NASA and forms the Southern State Women's Suffrage Association, because she fears that what NASA is doing is going to win Black women the vote. And she will eventually campaign, even as a suffragist, against the constitutional amendment enfranchising women. She'll campaign against that. Here's another thing that happens in 1905, just to give you a sense of, even among the white women leaders who maybe aren't, see themselves as being more progressive and more inclusive. There's a New York Women's Suffrage Association convention in Rochester, and they invite Harriet Tubman, who lives in Auburn, New York. You can see the way it's put in here, an aged negress is the way she's described, to come speak. So she's an honored speaker, right? She's not listed as one of the attendees. She's sort of there as a speaker. She's old by this time. This picture that we have here is from a few years later in 1911, but you get a sense. She is elderly. She travels by train. And if you read this, basically she gets there late at night and she spends the night in the train, because they've invited her, but they haven't made any arrangements for any place that she's going to sleep. And a Black woman can't just get a place to sleep in a boarding house. So she has to spend the night in the train station. And that gives you a sense of the kind of indignities that even honored and celebrated Black women have to face. So the story, of course, that we tell at Belmont Hall is the story of the new generation, the new woman of the 20th century, the youngsters who take up the fight for women's right to vote after the founding mothers like Stanton and Anthony have all died. And we particularly focus on Alice Paul, whose first kind of foray into the American women's suffrage movement is the procession down Pennsylvania Avenue in 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. And she puts right out front her kind of epitome of what this new woman looks like. It's Inez Milholland, beautiful and in control, all in white, on a white horse. This is what a feminist looks like, she's saying. And as she's organizing this procession, Jill Zonister in her biography really points out that sometimes the story we tell is that Alice Paul made Black women march in the back, and the situation is a lot more complicated than that. Jill Zonister found evidence that Alice Paul and others in this committee are reaching out to women at Howard University and assuming that Black women are going to march. They'd marched in New York before, but she's in D.C. And some of the women on the procession committee that are pictured here, particularly Helen Gardner and Elizabeth Kent, who's the wife of a congressman, they let Alice Paul know, oh, that's not the way we do things here in D.C. So you can't just have Black women marching with white women. It will be a scandal. The Southern women won't stand for it. So then Alice Paul starts to hedge. She's not really sure what to do. This is the way that the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, put it. The Women's Suffrage Party had a hard time settling on the status of Negroes at the Washington Parade. At first, Negro callers were received coolly at headquarters. Then they were told to register, but found that the registry clerks were usually out. Finally, an order went out to segregate them in the parade. But telegrams and protests poured in, and eventually the colored women marched according to their state and occupation without let or hindrance. That whole debacle leads to this sort of impression of what happened. This cartoon from the New York Tribune, you see it says, "Votes for white women." And up on the top it says, "Just like the men." And you see a white suffragist holding her hand out to a black woman holding the same "Votes for Women" sign. "No, no, not you." With a horrified look on her face, the white woman is saying, "No, no, not you." So it appears that although Alice Paul kind of wants to go along with what the other older women are telling her to leave black women out because she doesn't want to complicate things, and then she tries to get them to march in the back, the black women will not march in the back, and they demand to march where they belong. And we have the story of Howard women, the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, with their mentor, Mary Church Terrell, who are marching, and they demand to be included with the other, in the section with the other college women. They're not going to march anywhere else, and so they do. And the story that Mary Church Terrell tells about that is when some of the suffragists objected to having the colored girls of Howard University march in the parade, it was Inez Milholland who insisted that they be given a place with the pupils of the other schools. So this idea of beautiful white womanhood that Inez is supposed to represent, and she's out there as the prototypical suffragist, she's the one who's standing up to Alice Paul and the others and saying, no, they need to be able to march where they belong with the rest of us. One of the most famous stories from the suffrage parade is the Illinois delegation. So this in the middle here is Grace Trout, the leader of the Illinois suffrage delegation. Over on the right, I want to point out is Virginia Brooks, who we're going to talk about in a minute. The Illinois delegation comes down and includes perhaps the most famous woman in the group is Ida B. Wells Barnett. She is well known internationally as an investigative journalist and a speaker on issues of equality many different ways, against lynching, but also she has a suffrage club, the Alpha Suffrage Club. So she's probably the most famous woman there. But when they all come to basically gather for the procession, someone has told Grace Trout that she can't have Ida B. Wells march in her group, that it has to be a whites only group. And so she tells Ida B. Wells, you know, sorry, I guess you're going to have to go to the back. And Ida B. Wells is livid. She says, if the Illinois women do not take a stand now in this great Democratic parade, then the colored women are lost. And there's a couple of ways to look at that. It could be that she's saying, you know, you're abandoning us and we're going to be without our rights. But I also see it as, you know, we black women, we're good at organizing and getting things done, and you're going to lose our support if you keep treating us this way. And she says, I was asked to march with the other women of our state, and I intend to do so or not take part in the parade at all. She gets very upset and cries and storms off. She doesn't go to the back, though. One of the other women that I mentioned, Virginia Arnold, says she's not going to march either if Ida B. Wells isn't allowed. And they tell her, oh, you know, you can't do that. People are going to talk about your grandstanding. And she says, let anyone say anything that they please. I cannot prevent that, but I can prevent having one of our delegation left to march alone, almost as if she were in disgrace. And she and another woman, Belle Squire, say they're not going to march either if Ida B. Wells can't march. Well, Ida B. Wells has gone off, but she hasn't gone to the back. She's waiting along the procession route. And when the Illinois delegation passes by, she steps out right in front. So here is Ida B. Wells, here's Belle Squire, and here's Virginia Arnold, who have joined her, and they are being allies with her and stepping out in front with her. So the Chicago Tribune captured this photo and captured this story. We don't have the original photo, we only have the picture of the newspaper, so that's why it's not very clear. But this idea that that the Black women are not going to be pushed aside, not going to be segregated. Even though Mary Church Terrell repeatedly feels kind of belittled and pushed aside by Alice Paul, she continues to support the work of the National Women's Party. She becomes a member of what becomes the National Women's Party with Alice Paul, and she participates in many of their campaigns, including the one they're best known for, which is picketing the White House. And she and her daughter will get called, even in the cold and in terrible weather, to come. And she shows up and she stands there. I don't have any pictures of her picketing, unfortunately. But in a correspondence, it shows just the kind of determination and grace that these Black women have to have in the midst of this. Walter White, who is the head of the NAACP at this point, writes a letter to Mary Church Terrell about Alice Paul and other white suffragists, and you can tell from the letter that they've been talking about these things. So basically, he says, just as you say, all of them are mortally afraid of the South, and if they could get the suffrage amendment through without enfranchising colored women, they would do it in a moment. And so this is the situation throughout the fight for women's suffrage, of Black women repeatedly fighting for equality and often being left out and pushed aside and marginalized. And one of the ways that Alice Paul would explain the reason that she was doing this is she said, I feel very strongly that if you're going to do anything, you have to take one thing and do it. You can't try lots and lots of reforms and get them all mixed up together. And so to her, the issue of race was different than the issue of sex. And so she was fighting for equality based on sex. And if that meant that Black women got treated as badly as Black men did, well, as far as she was concerned, that was equality based on sex. Because she thought that if you're going to be politically savvy, if you're going to get things done, you can't get things complicated. But all of us are complicated. And she even said later on in 1974, I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated. But to me, there's nothing complicated about ordinary equality. That's one of the quotes from Alice Paul that you see a lot. And that's one that I always struggle with. Ordinary equality. Ordinary equality can be pretty complicated. So just think about that. What is complicated about this idea of ordinary equality? What's complicated about equality? Well, one of the things after the 19th Amendment passed is that people like Mary Church Terrell were asking Alice Paul and the National Women's Party and the League of Women Voters, which is what NASA became, to pay attention to things that Black women were facing, particularly in the South. You know, asking them to get behind the fight against lynching, to help with things like the intimidation and violence that women were facing at the polls, literacy tests that they would never be able to pass, poll taxes they couldn't afford. And Alice Paul and the National Women's Party's response was always that you're being discriminated against because of your race, not because of your sex, and that is not our issue. so you can see, even if you look at some of these barriers to voting, both past and present, there can be things that look like they're applied to everybody equally, but they have the disparate impact of affecting poor and Black and marginalized communities. And where do we stand on that when we're looking at equality? So, and I'll just leave us with the words of my favorite suffragist, Ida B. Wells Barnett: the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And if we want things to change, the first thing we have to do is talk about them and make sure that we tell the whole complicated story. So, thank you, everybody. I would love to hear whatever questions or comments anybody has.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was incredible, and just so wide-ranging and comprehensive. I see someone just raised their hand. If you have any questions, we have just a few minutes left of our program. Please drop them in the Q&A box, and we can go from there. There was a question, is the Brent Staples article, you said it was in the New York Times, is that still available? Some people had asked about wanting to see it.
Yes, I think I have a subscription. You might have to have a subscription, but it is available online. It was from July 2018.
I will say there are some fantastic resources that people have shared in the chat. There are different articles and different places to go to learn about books, learn about different people's perspectives and other things folks have published and shared about this exact issue. I really love that Ida B. Wells quote at the end. I think the way I talk about this a lot, so people who come to a lot of our programs will know this is a familiar tune for me. But I think that the way we are taught history in our schools and just culturally encourages us to lionize individuals, to make them into heroes, to make them not human. And it's so hard because you can't learn from someone who isn't a human. You can just have an impossible standard. And I think it's so important to remember that flawed people do great work. And we can still admire the great works while still rightly critiquing the mistakes, the things that should have been done differently that could have. And that's a hard one too, because that historical perspective.
So there are no people in history who are not problematic, because we are all problematic. And one thing that I take from that is the memory, well, we can do things too, even though we have things that we might not have listed about ourselves in the chat when we're telling our one thing, but that you can start from where you are and be ready to listen and reflect and do better the next time.
I think that's our charge, and that's what we try to encourage people. That's what we try to do at API, is we're always trying to do better next time. We have the work of carrying on this legacy of an incredible woman who made choices that, regardless of her intent, caused real harm to people in some cases. That doesn't mean we shouldn't continue the work. It means we should try to not cause harm.
Yes.
I'm so grateful to you for having this conversation, for having this conversation with us, and just for having it in general, for creating this program.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Yes, and you know what? Also, I can give you a list. One of the great things about the centennial is there's been so much so much new scholarship and so much of people wrestling with these same issues, that there's so many more resources available. We don't just have to go with the history of women's suffrage anymore. People have found these stories and are telling them, and so I can give you a whole list of some of the resources I have. And as you said, there's people who in the chat are sharing other resources as well. So
that would be great. The video recording of this presentation will be available. I don't know exactly when. We have to process it, and then we will upload it to our YouTube in the coming weeks. I won't give a date so no one can hold me to one, we have a lot of resources available on our website, alicepaul.org, and there's a page that's called resources. But also when we send the email out, Susan, if you'll share that with me, I can share that with everyone else, and I will download this chat and make sure that it is saved and those resources are available there as well. We are just out of time now. So let me see, we have, to the person who just asked if we can send a PDF, we cannot send a PDF of a New York Times article to you. That would be a copyright infringement, but you can give them your email and get a few free articles, I'm pretty sure, even if you don't want to do the subscription. And you might be able to find it elsewhere. I'm so sorry that we can't share that with you. So thank you again, Susan. And I'm looking forward to all the programs we'll be doing together in the future with the National Park Service. And thank you everyone who gave us an hour of your Saturday afternoon. If you liked this program and want to continue seeing programming like this, I would be so grateful, and so would everyone else at Alice Paul Institute, if you would hop over to our website and make a donation, since we are bringing you this for free, but our work is not free, so that would be eternally helpful. I hope to see many of you, if you are local, on August 26th, Women's Equality Day, for our reopening of Paulsdale. We will be debuting some new aspects of the visitor experience at the house. Masks will be inside, the rest of the events and things you can do will be outside, and we will be doing a deep dive into the Equal Rights Amendment on that day, so you can come and learn about the history of the ERA and how you can get involved in the ongoing fight to get it ratified. So I think that's all for today. Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone else. Take care.
Thank you.